All right. So hello, everyone, and welcome to this SARE event on scaling up offshore wind energy in Europe. My name is Marla Geibel. I'm a project manager here at SARE, and I have the very great pleasure to be introducing this event today. So today, SARE is presenting the key findings and recommendations of our upcoming report on offshore wind energy. And the report is co-authored by our research fellows, Professor Catherine Banet from the University of Oslo, and Professor Bert Willems from the University of Louvain, and it will be published imminently. So today we're focusing on the question on how EU regulatory action can help supporting the scale-up of offshore wind energy in Europe. And the report comes at a very crucial time and will hopefully be feeding into the discussions around the wind power package, but also the finalization of the electricity market design reform. And after the presentation of our recommendations, we will be discussing with a very great panel today, which I would like to introduce to you. So with us today, we have MEP Morten Petersen, who is the Vice Chair of the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy at the European Parliament. And he's also the Rapporteur of the Offshore Renewable Energy Strategy and the Shadow Rapporteur of the Electricity Market Design file. So it's very nice to have you here. We have with us Kristin Holm, who's an energy policy specialist at Norsk Hydro. Klaus, who's a senior economist at the Swedish Energy Market Inspectorate EI. Also with us today is Pittarello, who's the head of future interconnection at Ofgem. And last but not least, Alessandro Lazzarini, who is a senior engineer at the Planning and Permitting Department at Terna. And before we will go into the presentation, let me just very quickly go through some housekeeping rules. I'm sure you're all familiar with this already, but just to be sure. So this is supposed to be a very interactive event. So we do encourage everyone online to submit their questions via the question and answer function. And we will be monitoring the chat throughout the session and give some time towards the end of the panel to address your questions to our panelists. And also this session will be recorded and we will share the link of the recording and the report we are discussing today with you after the event. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Catherine and Bert, who will now present the main findings of the report.
Thank you very much, Marla, and welcome everyone. And I would like to start by thanking very much all the sponsors who contributed to the discussions around this report that we are very proud to present you today, some of the findings, and as well very pleased to have MEP Morten Petersen with us again today. Would like as well to thank the whole SARE team for an amazing support as well. So we are today presenting the main context, but as well the main findings for our report that Professor Bert Willems and I worked on during the past months. And we combine a law and economics analysis for completing this report. Some parts are more legal, some others related to cross-border project also combine a strong economic analysis. So we will start by as well a general context. If you can move to the next slide, please. That is related to the need for developing a common European approach to offshore wind development. And as Marla already mentioned, the main purpose with our report was to analyze how EU regulatory action can now help supporting the scaling up of offshore wind energy in Europe. Because the level of ambition is already high. We have the EU offshore renewable energy strategy, the ORE strategy, that calls for 300 gigawatt offshore wind, in addition to 40 gigawatt of ocean energy installed capacity in the EU by 2050. And in parallel, we have a series of political declarations signed at the sea basins level in the the 5 EU sea basins that have announced joint targets for offshore wind. An example of that is the 2023 Ostend Declaration, which alone sets targets of at least 300 gigawatts by 2050 in the North Sea. So it's topping this EU ambition. And offshore wind has become an essential pillar of the continent's trajectory towards net zero, as well as the implementation of the REPower EU plan that has increased further this ambition of contribution of renewable energy in the energy mix. The offshore wind sector is currently facing, therefore, great enthusiasm, but as well what has been described a perfect storm with a mix of strong demand, constrained supply, and inflationary pressures resulting in increased cost. In addition, we are witnessing the development of projects that are not limited to radial or just traditional interconnections as we have today, but as well moving towards hybrid projects, increasingly meshed grid, and that is raising new regulatory challenges. So hybrid offshore projects connecting more than one bidding zone can bring substantial socio-economic welfare improvements by allowing a more optimal use of the sea areas that are getting very crowded, an increase in market integration, a more coordinated investment planning, and a decrease in system cost. A fast development of offshore wind generation capacity in the EU is therefore entering a critical phase where we see the need of targeted additional action. And this is urgently needed as well an implementation of the ORE strategy. It has started to be implemented in several ways through the follow-up of emergency measures, through the revision of the RED II directive and the market design. But in addition, we need further actions to implement the ORE strategy vision. And that applies to the scale-up of offshore wind in generation, transmission, distribution, and market design. And with the strategy of the European Commission, we see the development of a new regulatory agenda for offshore renewable energy sources and a new market framework for offshore wind energy in particular. In our report, we identify 4 key areas for targeted action in order to support the scaling up of offshore wind in Europe. And we do that by analyzing the currently applicable legislation, but as well EU legislative initiatives, and we formulate some recommendations for improvement. So trying to as well contribute to the current debate and the upcoming package that Marla mentioned. The 4 areas relate to planning, permitting, cross-border projects, and mutual and local benefits, including coexistence. And we have a core question under each of these items that I will come back to. The report envisages the EU action from a double angle or double lens. That is first, how EU intervention can assist the member states when scaling up offshore wind at national level in order to reach the EU targets and to preserve cross-border trade on the internal energy market. The second lens relates to EU's intervention that can support the upcoming challenges when the large-scale deployment of offshore wind energy will result in more hybrid systems and gradually more meshed networks across member states' borders. As a first point in this analysis, and in terms of recommendations, we look at what type of EU regulatory approach is to be favored. And here we have a series of recommendations related to that. First, EU initiatives, as we all know, that are expected to have a significant economic, social, and environmental impact must be subject to an impact assessment. The need for EU intervention in line with the subsidiarity and proportionality principles is an intrinsic part of this assessment. But as we have seen as well in the report from the European Court of Auditors on EU policy on notably offshore wind, there is a need to complete a detailed impact assessment, including on environmental consequences. And there have been some criticism as to the breadth of this impact assessment regarding environmental criteria, notably. Another element related to the need to impact assessment is that the lack of impact assessment will de facto limit the scope of action of notably the European Commission in proposing any legislative reforms in the short run. That has a direct impact for the upcoming package that has been announced in October, because we don't have the time to complete a full impact assessment, so it can't build on existing impact assessments, but there is no time for assessing new legislative proposals, for example. So that's the first point. Then when we discuss what can the EU do, what can the EC propose, we need to think as well in terms of what is going on in terms of project developments, and we have different companies represented here. And therefore, because we know that the projects are still maturing, technologies and grid design are still evolving. We argue in our report for a gradual development of the rules, proceeding by steps and adjusting possibly along the way. And this is particularly relevant for the changes that we witness in offshore grid configurations following the addition of new production, conversions assets, storage assets, but as well the connection of new grid segments. So the business model need to change. But the lack of legal certainty is already an issue for investments, and we don't want that a gradual regulatory approach be an additional barrier to investment. So when we talk about gradual regulatory approach, we believe that we should start by, in a targeted manner, clarifying first the fundamental elements of market structure, such as the legal definition of hybrids and cost-benefit sharing principles for this. There is already ongoing work around these principles of cost-benefit sharing, but this needs urgently to be supported by at least some guidance that the member states can implement. The EC could therefore provide further guidance in two ways. First, describe options to develop market-sound solutions within the framework of currently applicable legislation, and then, after a period of regulatory oversight, put forward proposals for legislative reform. So that will contribute to legal certainty that is needed, legal clarity, and that could lead to market legislation reform on the long run. There is here a balance to strike, as always, between multi-speed Europe and harmonized rules based on developments we see in the different sea basins. And this appears again in the context of offshore wind, as we have seen in other areas of EU policy. Progressing at different speeds in the different sea basins should not prevent advancing common EU rules, but it provides useful experiences, regulatory experiences moving towards harmonization. And that's something that we can use as well, testing what is possible under current legislation and then moving towards a consolidation of EU legislation. So the approach per sea basin is relevant and will be even more relevant as we develop cross-border projects. It will be confronted to some challenges when different countries with different treaties binding these members around the sea basin are supporting this project. And this is the case in the North Sea, where we find not only EU member states, but as well EEA member states with Norway, and we have the UK. So here we need as well some legal certainty around this project, and this could be done through memorandums of understanding offshore, but as well by more binding agreements to provide legal certainty. The approach we recommend also support a regulatory oversight, regulatory monitoring, and a tight cooperation between the different national regulatory authorities of the same sea basin. So this should be further emphasized. There are already entities and that can be used and even more transparent. Part of a sea basin approach might also be an efficient solution to propose packages of projects, not only having one infrastructure and asset after the other one, but already putting together packages of projects. And it will probably not be one big bidding zone as well per sea basin, but several ones based on congestion management. And that's an issue Professor Willems will come back to. Additionally, EU action must be coherent and consistent with recent and ongoing legislative reforms that relates to electricity market design, permitting acceleration under RED 3, and the newly revised 10E regulation. Not least, the compliance with biodiversity and ocean protection objectives must be ensured, and this requires good planning and coordinated development of the maritime space on the way towards sustainable blue economy. Permitting procedures are instrumental in assessing environmental and social impacts of offshore wind projects, as well as promoting coexistence and local benefits of different types. We come back to that. However, only relying on the current legal framework is likely not sufficient to address the cumulative environmental and social impact of offshore wind projects. That's something that the European Court of Auditors is also commenting. Moving towards our second point, that is planning, and first point of analysis in our key targeted action. The question we raise here is how can the development of offshore wind projects become part of an integrated plan for the blue economy? And here our recommendations are the following ones. We should have a clear identification of the responsible bodies for ensuring an alignment of the maritime spatial plans on the one hand with the national energy and climate plans on the other one. And these could be through the definition for these bodies of a duty to assess and report on the degree of alignment between objectives and the plans. The EC should continue to provide best practice guidance, as well as soft law guidance when it is relevant. A more integrated grid planning approach between production and infrastructure and across member states should be promoted. Transmission needs and concrete projects should be aligned, so at the level of the sea basin. Grid planning processes, onshore and offshore, cannot be disconnected. This is for reason of adequacy. And we see as a natural step that the seabed offshore network development plans and high-level strategic offshore network development plans are aligned with the existing 10-year network plan for the grids development. Similarly, an integration of energy system perspective must be pursued. There should be more clarity as to the role allocation for grid planning processes offshore. Sometimes it's not clear, and the scope as well of the planning process, holistic, project, pair gauge, or per project approach should be pursued. We argue in favor of using the existing mechanisms that are defined in Governance System for Energy Union and the 10E regulation to advance coordinated planning and cross-project development across the borders. So use these mechanisms, and this could be through notably the definition of some milestone when we define the trajectories, so a tighter steering and control through the planning processes. In order to optimize the reuse of existing offshore installation, a more proactive policy in terms of decommissioning, reuse, and repurposing should be promoted, as it has been under other packages, for example, for gas. But here we have an opportunity to further emphasize that area. And then we could also, in the absence or as an alternative to a joint TSO or regulator offshore, regional fora like the North Seas Energy Corporation should be used to ensure regional grid coordination. Moving to the next point, that is permitting. Permitting is critical. We have seen actions in terms of speed up of permitting under both emergency measures and newly adopted proposals for revising the Renewable Energy Directive. Still, the court proceedings remain a major factor in delays, both onshore and offshore. And national best practices and new EU proposals could further address this problem. Further guidance is also needed as to best practices when merging processes for offshore wind farms permitting and cable permitting, in our view. And then I pass the word to my colleague, Professor Willems.
Thanks, Catherine. So for my part, I would like to highlight 7 recommendations. So I did not go through all the recommendations, and they're meant as a sort of teaser. So I'm not going to give all the disclaimers and all the sort of argumentation. So for that, I will refer to the report. So I'll start from an observation that we'll expect to see a lot of economies of scale in future offshore networks. So in a mesh network, there are those economies of scale. So this basically means that from a regulatory viewpoint, that we would like to see network unbundling, that we want to have regulated network tariffs. And given that we are building up this network, we want to have forward-looking investment by TSOs. So this basically means that they're going to have to build for demand that still needs to arise. So then we also see that coordinated TSO planning is necessary because of those positive externalities. And we think that this should go beyond alignment of national plans. But we also would like to see some joint benefit optimization, co-optimization of those different plans. And we want that the result of those planning also leads to binding agreements between TSO or between member states. So in the medium term, we also think that interconnection regulation needs upgrading, not only for offshore, but maybe also for onshore connections. So we currently have the 70% rule or the 15% openness rule, but they are a bit ad hoc and not always based on cost-benefit considerations. And this might not be consistent when we start introducing bidding zones offshore or multiple zones onshore. So we think it would be useful to think about additional metrics to measure the degree of market integration of the main energy trading hubs. So this could mean that it's maybe not just the bidding zones that cross or close the border, but it's the main demand and main supply centers that should be well integrated. And with the competitive tendering for specific offshore locations as the preferred market model, given that we believe that the governments are going to steer the investment locations, the focus of the regulation should be on providing regulatory certainty. So already what Catherine said, so the investors, they should have regulatory certainty, even though regulation might still be changing. So that should be one focus. And we also state that we want to have regulation which is consistent with this long-term view of those regulated network access, network tariffs, and these economies of scale. The next point that we would like to highlight is that the business case of offshore wind depends crucially on accessing the liquid onshore market. So this is mainly the spot market, but also financial markets where they can hedge their risk, because we don't see that there is going to be liquid offshore financial market. So their connectedness with the onshore market is crucial. And therefore, we propose that there should be long-term financial instruments that help wind farms to hedge their congestion risks and also compensate them for the unavailability of network capacity. So this might go beyond some of the proposals that already has been given. So we also want to avoid hold-up when TSO might start postponing investments in the cost allocation model, because then maybe they might claim larger costs in this cost-benefit study. So we think it's very important, if we start allocating the cost for hybrid investments, that there are clear baseline scenarios where it's clear what part of the cost can be allocated to the national investment and onshore investment, and which part of the investment should be linked to the hybrid investments. And coming back to also to what Catherine said, sorry, Marla. So the cost-benefit study is very important. So this baseline scenario is one of the issues that we raised, but we also raised that it might be useful to consider not piecemeal single investment, but to think about the bigger evolvement of a package of different projects. And this has certain advantages because you will have more likely to create win-win situations in the negotiation. And you also avoid that the cost allocation might depend on the arbitrary order in which you're going to consider projects. Okay, so then back to Catherine.
Yes, and moving to the last point in the report that relates to benefits, but as well mutual and local benefits. And that has two dimensions. When we talk about mutual benefits, we looked at coexistence, and we know that coexistence is very early on an issue already at the level of the planning and notably the special maritime planning. The EC should take due account to carrying out impact assessments, including environmental issues, as I stress, and as the European Court of Auditors has been commenting on, each time it puts forward new policy and legislative proposals. And this also applies to national level. So the planning is the first, is the starting point for assessing whether there is a conflict between different interests and how we could possibly solve that. Then we find the same interaction at the permitting level as part of the impact assessment for different projects and licensing procedure. So these are known instruments that must be used as full. As the actors in the blue economy, talking broadly, may have different interest in their use of the sea areas, there is a legitimate need for public intervention in ensuring coexistence, in addition to informal cooperation between the different actors. And the EU's role is therefore to ensure the attainment of EU goals in terms of nature protection, renewable energy developments, and industrial policies and internal market preservation. The EU action around sharing of good practices is already very well developed, and it should only continue, notably through elaboration of good practices and platform for exchange of best practices around coexistence. And this applies to all stages of offshore wind projects development, from planning, but as well to tendering, award operation, and decommissioning. A minimum harmonization of the measures on the mapping and solving of coexistence potential could, however, be reinforced. This applies at the level of the special maritime planning, where cross-border coexistence potentials should be better mapped and addressed, with the definition of an obligation to assess such potential and report on the results of the assessment. Similarly, an obligation to ensure early stakeholder engagement as part of the tender requirements for offshore wind tenders could be helpful in ensuring coexistence. And finally, the inclusion of multi-use as a qualitative criteria in tendering and permitting processes is also an effective tool. When we turn to the other element of the benefits, that is the promotion of local benefits, this happens mostly as a non-price criteria in offshore wind auctions. The EU legislation, and primarily the Renewable Energy Directive as it is revised, and stated guidelines on climate, environmental protection and energy already allow for giving weight to non-price criteria as part of offshore wind tendering. And in order to preserve the level playing field between the actors, but as well to promote good practices, we support the idea of having the EC giving further guidance as to the definition of non-price criteria in auctions. The need for alignment between non-price criteria in offshore wind auctions is particularly important in the perspective of cross-border projects, as we comment in the previous section, and increasingly meshed grids, because we will see that the national tendering and support schemes will be juxtaposed. And then we have a natural need as well for alignment. Why the member states are responsible for designing auctions, further clarification to that respect could therefore come as an amendment to the stated guidelines, the CEAG. Further clarification should be given on this stage for allowing non-price criteria for qualification, tendering of award, we recommend. And this would notably enable a consistent interpretation of the stated rules, but as well avoid diverging national practices, increasing risk of distortion of competition. Further clarification is also needed as to which non-price elements are accepted in the tendering process, where a distinction might need to be made between criteria related to innovation, environmental protection, and circularity, and other criteria that resemble local content requirements that are otherwise forbidden under WTO and EU law, but that may give, in practice, an unfair advantage to national champions or local companies, and so contradict competition rules. So that ends the list of our recommendations related to these 4 areas. And I give the word back to you, Marla.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both very much for your very insightful presentation. So we will now have the chance to discuss your findings with the audience and with the panel a bit more in detail. So I've already introduced everyone earlier, but you can see everyone again on this slide. So for the beginning of this panel, I would like to ask every panelist for their initial reactions, around about 2 to 3 minutes ideally, before Catherine will then go a bit more into a detailed discussion with you. And I will start with Morten. Could you please share your initial thoughts, reactions with us for the recommendations, please?
Absolutely, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you today. And again, apologies for the technical hiccup initially. Now, I take great interest in what you're saying and your findings in this. And I think overall speaking, that emphasizing a common European approach is so right to do and to emphasize, and so difficult to do, because given the ramp up needed, we have to scale up in a speed that is simply unheard of if we are to be even close to fulfilling our 2030 targets and all the gigawatts that we need to install. So we simply need to move to a common approach rather than having a national approach to this. And this obviously applies to permitting in the sea basins. It applies to grids and infrastructure and all these other issues. So I think it's really an important finding and emphasis that you're making on trying to apply this common approach. Now, the devil is in the detail in all this, and it's so difficult to do because we still have a very, say, national approach to planning and to implementing on this. But I'd say things are moving in the big picture and should be moving because if they aren't, then we're simply not fulfilling. I take note of your thoughts on tenders as well, and as you know, and this is probably going to be part of this wind package that we're all expecting that will come out in 2 weeks' time, and there will for sure be emphasis also on price criteria, but perhaps with a bit of another angle than that what you presented here today, given that China is coming, the Chinese are coming in the offshore industry as well, and there's a lot of worry in this house, in this town, on not to replicate what's happened in the solar business, basically. So I think we will see some kind of non-price criteria, perhaps pre-evaluation criteria related to cybersecurity. Obviously, criteria related to state aid, given that what we are seeing outside of the union right now is that you see installation of Chinese mills with state aid, massively supported by Beijing, and this will be looked into. I think, roughly speaking, you could argue that if we want to have a European production base, also in the offshore industry, we have to move on some of these issues as well. So I'm deeply worried about what is happening now, and adding to all this, obviously high interest rates, high inflation, leading to price increases in the magnitude of 30-40% or so. So we see a lot of European clean tech companies that are suffering at the moment because of a combination of all these factors. So so having a common European approach to this is of high significance, and if we don't succeed in this, then we won't fulfill our 2030 targets in terms of climate, and I think there's a real worry of fear of losing out to competitors outside of Europe if we do not get this right. So thanks again for the invite, and thanks again for these interesting findings. I look very much forward to join the discussion later on. Thanks again.
Thank you, Morten. Thanks. I'm sure Catherine will have a couple of follow-up questions later on. But firstly, let me move to Kristin. Could you also please, for 2-3 minutes, give us your initial statement on the recommendations, please?
Absolutely. Yes, I also want to thank this academic team, Catherine and Bert, for a very good and comprehensive report, and also the presentation you just gave us, very interesting. And I agree, it's this scale up of offshore wind is an enormous job we have in front of us, and I think you've covered about all the relevant issues, and it's a lot that needs to be addressed and not at least coordinated to support this scaling up of offshore wind, both this regulatory approach, planning, permitting, market design, auction models, and so on. So, and I'm glad you also highlighted the main barriers, dilemmas, and possible solutions in a very good way. So I'll absolutely recommend this report for the decision makers. I think I could give some reflections from my kind of my perspective from my company, which is both a big industrial consumer, but also a producer and a potential future developer and owner in offshore wind parks. So maybe I could start from a consumer perspective. And first of all, from that perspective, it is important that we succeed with this scaling up, that we build more power production faster, so that we can have a robust power supply balance in Europe. That's absolutely needed to get affordable prices for the industrial consumer. And secondly, I want to emphasize that it is important that these volumes, at least some of these volumes, will be available for industrial PPAs. Because industries, as us, especially aluminium industry, which we are part of, we need to hedge our price exposure on long-term PPAs. And therefore, we are a bit concerned about if all volumes are kind of sold on CFDs, which in reality is a PPA with the government. So I would like to see more considerations on auction models where actually the wind park or the wind park investor is responsible for the route to market. But also an assessment on how these CFD volumes could be redistributed to consumers in one way or another at kind of competitive price levels. As a consumer, we're also sensitive to proposals where the business case for a wind park could be at expense of the onshore consumers, of course. So we are a bit skeptical to using kind of congestion income to de-risk or subsidize wind parks. Also through this so-called transmission access guarantees, if I understand these right. And we also see it's very complicated to calculate such compensation. So we would prefer other maybe compensation schemes. But this is also linked, of course, to the tariff models of the wind park, if they should pay all the costs and how to share the cost also offshore and onshore. So this is a complex picture. A few words from the developer side. And there we think, first of all, it's important to focus on robust business cases. And the currently lack of legal certainty that you rightfully pointed on, both of you, around offshore wind regime is a clear barrier to investments. So to conclude on some of the discussions on market design, distribution of congestion income, and so on would be very helpful for security for the wind investor. I agree that the regulatory development probably needs to be developed stepwise, because this is kind of a new thing. But the business case needs to be robust for new regulations. So that's really important. So a gradual regulatory approach must not be become a barrier to investments. When it comes to these auction models, I see that these big auctions is good for getting huge volumes online fast. But I would also like to mention that such big auction will exclude smaller investors that are not able to take on such big risks early in the development process. So what we call open door processes, where projects can be developed gradually with more limited risks upfront, will attract a wider range of developers and probably provide room for more innovation and creativity. That's what we believe. And to the non-price criteria.
Thank you, Kristin. I just maybe we can keep some of the points for the discussion later, just to give everyone the opportunity to just do a quick round of reactions. Thank you very much already, though. Just to also already bring the regulator's perspective in, Klaus, can I maybe start with you and go to Sweden for your initial reactions to the recommendations, your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. First, I would like to thank the authors for a great report, very interesting to read and very comprehensive. So I will have some time ahead of me to read all what is inside the report. I think the approach is quite important, that you start with the EU can help the essentially or supports the scaling up of the offshore wind energy sector. And I think what we work on, what I see, what you emphasize quite often is having regulatory impact assessments and cost-benefit analysis and that type. And I think that is very valuable that you repeat that quite an awful lot, because regulatory impact assessment have not been the forte of the EU recently, I would say, especially not when we come to the electricity market reform, and we will probably not get a really good one for the offshore wind either. So I think that is something that we need to improve, and we are working usually quite a lot with impact assessments and so on at the agency as a regulator. So going beyond that, the report itself tackles most of the relevant issues, starting with planning, and of course we also promote and emphasize the coordination of different plans and so on. That is quite important. Those things need to be co-emphasized, co-optimized essentially, and that is not really always a strength in, for example, in Sweden and other countries, which effectively leads to a slower development of the offshore wind development. But what is most interesting for us in the report, or maybe where we as regulators are most involved or in the economic part on the cross-border projects, where we also give more or less a clearer answer how the regulation should be, or how regulation is done. That is where you say that you recommend that national TSOs remain responsible for planning, owning, and operating the offshore network within the economic zone of each country. That is quite clear statement, because that's something we still don't have these things in Sweden, but there are a lot of neighbors around us where we could have those projects with, or the plans ahead of us. So it's good to know how to tackle those problems. Then you also mentioned those questions of offshore bidding zones, and that's also something that we have been thinking about in the context of the electricity market reforms. And I think that's also your answer is essentially it's not really a good idea. And I think that's helpful to us to what more we have the questions also. One thing that's on mutual and local benefit, and that's something that we very often see, is a problem that you have offshore wind farms that are stopped by acceptance problems. So you see them can see the top of a wind farm far ahead, but that's already a disturbance that is enough to make people fight the offshore wind farms, and that is something that could be developed within the report, because we also had a government public inquiry on that topic, how to compensate maybe companies on or the public for offshore wind farms. Then you have some things about the one thing that was mentioned also by Anna Karin was also in the report, that was that one on local contents. I'm not so sure if you should have those goals, but regulations in the auction team, and it will make auctions more complicated, but including environmental and other standards in the auction should be standard in some way. And what more did I have?
I think that's
there's a couple of things that lack, and one problem is essentially that we don't have, that you exclude and need to exclude, of course, national court processes. They can all very often take an awful lot of time, but they are not really involved in that report. And you have the defense interests that also stop offshore wind, at least in Sweden. So that are aspects that are not really treated. So with that, I leave the word to the next. Thank you. Great report, anyway.
Thanks, Klaus. Nick, let's go to the UK, to the UK's perspective. What's your first reaction to the recommendations presented today?
Thank you, Marla. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to join the panel today. Just by way of background, at Ofgem, I'm responsible for developing a regulatory framework for offshore hybrid assets in Great Britain. And I'm currently working on 2 pilot offshore hybrid asset projects, one to Belgium and one to the Netherlands, and both of them are aiming to be operational around 2030. And I think, as MEP Morten Petersen has already said, I would agree that the devil very much is in the detail on these projects. I think that this is a very interesting report and actually asks some really important questions. And as the report explains, combining interconnectors with offshore wind farms is more efficient than radially collected wind. And we know that the wind, at best, only blows half the time, and therefore the interconnector can be used for cross-border trade when the wind isn't blowing. And they can also reduce the impact of additional onshore infrastructure. So hybrid assets are essential to the scaling up of EU offshore wind. I'm conscious that the report focuses on EU member states. However, the North Sea basin is a fabulous wind resource, and one that the UK and Norway and the EU need to jointly develop together if we want to achieve the very ambitious offshore targets that you alluded to earlier on. So this report studies how EU intervention can address the upcoming challenges when large-scale deployment of offshore wind energy will result in more hybrid systems. My particular interest in this report is the type of EU regulatory approach to be favoured for cross-border projects. As the report highlights, many elements of grid and market design are still to be defined, and this is a potential blocker to the rollout of hybrid schemes. Indeed, as the report says, further legal clarifications are needed when not all neighbouring states are EU member states. And I've been working very closely with my Belgian and Dutch counterparts on the 2 projects, on Nautilus and Lion Link, over the last 18 months. And both projects consist of an interconnector and an offshore island or platform connecting offshore wind that is located in EU waters. And one of our challenges has been that there isn't much clarity on how offshore bidding zones work. And that's something that we need to jointly develop together. It's a very important area because not only does it have a big impact on both price and volume risk for offshore wind, but the asymmetric distribution of congestion income that accrues on these assets needs to be shared fairly. Otherwise, it will undermine future investment in offshore hybrid assets. And I should emphasise that this isn't a UK-specific issue, but one that will be an issue for all EU member states looking to build these kinds of assets. So the cost-benefit sharing principles should also take into account contributions from third countries. So in summary, this report is a good start, a good basis for analysis, but as ever, more work is needed. And from my perspective, this should include more work on offshore bidding zones, development of efficient implicit trading in the North Sea, and perhaps potentially the development of a North Sea's congestion income sharing agreement. But I wanted to take the opportunity to express my sincere thanks to both Professors Banet and Willems for their hard work in developing this report, and I look forward to further discussions and next steps.
Thanks, Nick, for your feedback. Thanks a lot. Alessandro, last but not least, going to Italy. We would be really interested to hear your thoughts about the recommendations.
Good afternoon, and thank you for your invitation, and thank you for the very interesting report and presentation. Well, I think, as mentioned before, and also as highlighted in the report, a further evolution in the regulatory and the legislative framework might represent a key element to further promote the development of the offshore technology in line with the EU ambition and target. And moreover, I think that it is important that this regulatory adjustment should be gradual and proceeding by step, considering that also the offshore technology is still evolving, and moreover, also the specific characteristic of each sea basin across Europe might be taken into consideration, since the grid and offshore development is proceeding at a different pace and with different level of maturity across Europe. Indeed, bringing to the table the experience of Terna and of the Italian scenarios, the offshore development represents a quite recent phenomenon. Indeed, nowadays, currently, a plant of 30 megawatts is connected to the national transmission grid, and a significant rise in connection requests of offshore plants has been observed only in the latest year, with a significant increase of 200% in barely 2 years, thanks to the technological development occurred for the offshore technology, skyrocketing to the unprecedented value of around 19 gigawatts of plants to be connected to the grid. And most of this generation capacity, moreover, is located in area characterized by high water depth, involving the use of floating technology, which involves more complexities in terms of higher cost and technological issues. So bringing to the table the experience of Terna as the transmission system operator of Italy, Terna is working accordingly to his role to guarantee a connection to every producer asking for a connection, and also to other applicants, providing a minimal technical solution to connect the power plants to the grid. Moreover, Terna is currently analyzing and monitoring the evolution of the offshore framework and scenario, carrying out study, researchers, and benchmark with other grid operators and with the producer, manufacturers, and primary industries in the energy sector, in order to share information, best practice, and being always capable of providing the most cost-effective and cost-efficient solution, connection solution to the new capacity to be integrated into the grid. And I think that this cooperation, improve the cooperation within all the stakeholders and of grid operator, is quite a fundamental thing to be carried out. Thank you. I'm looking forward to the next step of the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Alessandro. So I will now pass on the word to Catherine, who will have a couple of follow-up questions to the interesting points you've already mentioned. And also, I would like to just make sure again that you feel free to use the question and answer section. We will have some time in the end if you do have some comments. Yeah, Catherine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marta. Well, I would like to ask my co-author, Bert, if he has immediate reaction to what has been said on our report, and maybe on the offshore bidding zones approach and congestion income management. Bert?
Yeah, so I wrote, I have like 2 or 3 pages of notes, so I will try to pick some points. So about the offshore bidding zones, so we say that we start from the observation that close integration from the hybrid assets into the existing market coupling is necessary. That can be done with offshore bidding zones, but maybe alternative ways could be like stochastic transmission capacity. So I think that offshore bidding zones might be an easy way to include this in the model. But we also show that this market might not be very liquid. There might not be financial markets. So there are those unexpected consequences from that. So one is allocation of congestion rents. We heard from Ofgem that this is an issue that we need to take that into account, that that the definition of the bidding zones have those effects. It has the effect that for the wind farms that they have this uncertain local price, then they need to get some hedging for those congestion rents. It has an effect then also on the interconnection regulation, where the interconnection regulation was meant to create market integration, but not necessarily integrating offshore bidding zones. So the definition there is also then sort of hindered. So the introduction of those cross-border, the offshore bidding zones seems to be an easy way because we already have those bidding zones, but there are sort of unintended or some consequences that we might not have foreseen. So you could say maybe we need an impact assessment, although we're using the existing framework of bidding zones. So I think that's so that comes back to what Klaus was saying a little bit. So we're not really necessarily against offshore bidding zones, but there are those additional effects there. Then on the allocation of congestion rents, so the allocation matters a lot for the TSOs and allocating the benefits between 2 different countries. So we would like that the allocation is clear. When you start talking about cost allocation, you need to know already what's the bidding zone definition before deciding about how much you share the cost, because you have expectation about the congestion rents. It also then affects the congestion income for the TSOs. And then the question is, should this income go for the TSO budget, or should this be paid back to the investors? So that's Inger's question. And we started from the assumption that we will have competition for, let's say, the location. And our idea was that you get a waterbed effect, that if you tell them, okay, you have to pay your own congestion costs, this creates some uncertainty. It's also going to create some costs, and you're going to get some cost shifting, but they're also going to ask for a reward for the risk that they're taking. And this risk might be related also with regulatory risk, like regulatory uncertainty, because they might not know how the zones are going to be defined. And I'm in favor of giving firms, let's say, investment risk, but we don't want to give them political risk, because that's just a cost for society and it's not really efficient. So what we could think then also is whether the permit rents should then be reallocated to energy users. And I think that's a broader discussion once we start introducing CFDs. I think that's a broader discussion we need to have at the EU level. Who is going to benefit from those? Is this the household? Is this going to be the big industry? Do we want certain countries to advantage their big industry or not? And do we treat, for instance, nuclear energy that also maybe creates some additional rents? Do we treat that in the same way? Do we allow only countries to subsidize the big industry with renewable energy, or do we also allow this with nuclear? So I think this is a bit of a broader question on also on solidarity mechanism. Who has sort of the access to certain of those rents? I guess on the China case, I think also that would be a nice place where we want to have an impact assessment, because there's a lot of politics involved. And there's a lot of gut feeling that we are in the race with China. And I think it would be nice to see, okay, do we want to have state aid, trade restrictions? What would be good ways to deal with that? And might also be a collaboration with China. But I'm not a trade economist, but I think that's where I would like to see some economic impact analysis, because there might be risk of politicians overreacting.
Thank you, Bert. Then we'll go back to some questions to the different panelists, and I will start with MEP Morten Petersen. And you came back to the issue of the upcoming package that we are all waiting for now to see what exactly it will contain. What will be your wish list for this upcoming package?
First of all, we have obviously the challenge that we're in mid-October and we have elections coming up in June, so it'll be difficult, if not impossible, to do actual legislation, and this is important to have in mind. So I want to see obviously enforcement of already adopted rules or directives or regulations, what have you. I mean, we have huge issues with some of the stuff that we adopted already in the previous electricity market design not being implemented across the board, across member states. And this applies to a wide range of issues as well. So I'd say implementation of some of the stuff that we already did will be extremely important. A lot will have to be done in member states, basically, because we see no final investment decisions now or last year, even all over Europe. Very few, at least. And we all know that ambitions are high, and we need to ramp up, we need to scale up, and what have you. We've cut down some time issues related to the renewables directive within go-to zones. So there are opportunities for member states to move faster than what they're doing right now. So a lot of this has to do with implementation. But having said this, I think it's extremely important, and I hope this also would be a part of the package, so to speak, apart from enforcement, apart from looking at state aid issues, apart from looking at implementation, that I think we have to somehow address that these tenders where you see member states collecting a lot of revenue is simply detrimental to the scale up of industry right now. We saw the German tender with billions coming in from some of the major oil companies. Nick can probably tell us about the situation in UK and your tender over there, where no one actually put in a bid, as far as I was told. So we have a total mismatch right now between ambitions and what is actually happening out there. And addressing this, also saying frankly to member states that if you keep on trying to optimize just revenue for these lease of seabeds or whatever you call it, then we're not getting there. And this we cannot address through legislation because it's too late in the political cycle, and because responsibility ultimately lies with member states. But for sure, we can make the case, and we'll have to make the case vis-a-vis member states. So to sum up, a lot of implementation, a lot of monitoring on state aid issues, and watching also out for what's happening in China, and then notching and urging member states to have a different look at these tender criteria related also to non-price criteria. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was very clear, and that makes a nice transition to Nick. than you were called upon the most. Can you, two things, can you comment on the recent experience in the UK with the famous auction rounds that was commented during the summer? And second, I would like as well to ask you, because you mentioned that that's a very interesting idea, the type of agreement we will need between states around the North Sea, and that could apply as well to other sea basins where there are energy community countries. And then maybe Alessandro can comment if there is any concrete plans there to move forward. What do you see as a necessary agreement there? So
Yes.
Two questions to you, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. So yes, the first on the CFD auction that was held in the UK. I think it's no surprise that the supply chains are being squeezed. There's immense demand. Inflationary pressures are driving up the cost of build and implementation for wind farm developers, and it just seems that the price being offered just wasn't sufficient to incentivize developers to make a bid, and clearly government's going to need to think about that in more depth. In terms of the agreement, I think it would certainly speed things up if we all knew upfront how we were going to share the costs and benefits of a mesh grid in the North Sea. And I know that there's a lot of work going on in that thinking with NSEC. I'm sure they're working very hard on that for the North Sea specifically. But you're absolutely right, Catherine. There's no reason why all sea basins shouldn't have some kind of common approach to understanding how costs and benefits are shared. And I think that would certainly speed things up from a regulatory alignment perspective, which at the moment is taking an awful lot of time and delaying progress. So I would certainly advocate for something like that.
Thank you very much, Nick. And indeed, we see a lot of work in the context of this sea basin area, and we already have, in a way, de facto framework that can be further used with a bit more of transparency. That will be sometimes nice to have. I then would like to ask Alessandro, how do they perceive this approach as well per sea basin? And another element that you raised and is the difference between the different technologies between floating and bottom fixed. So if you can further develop on how this should be taken into account in the way we're moving now forward, or we should just have a technology neutral approach to the next step. Thank you.
Well, in general, in the Italian context, it has been submitted agreement with other countries which share the same sea basin of Italy to in order relating the development of the offshore technology and the offshore installation in the offshore corridors identified by the European Commission and at the European level. So agreements are being undertaken, and for the difference in technologies, I think that in general a neutral approach might be an interesting approach, and I think that also, but it is quite a recent phenomenon, as I said before, and so I think that the technology has to change and to evolve the floating technology to draft up a final consideration about that. But if I may, I want to address one of the most important points for Terna and stress out to achieve the climate and energy target to 2030, which is the permitting areas and the authorization procedures. Since a lot has been done recently with the directives and in the 10-year regulation, but to achieve the challenging climate and energy targets of 2030 within this challenging time horizon, other measures should be taken into place in order to further speed up and facilitate the permitting procedure. In general, to meet the decarbonization target, a great amount of new renewable capacity is expected to be realized utilized in the European energy system. And this new capacity required an increase in transmission capacity for the national grid in order to manage the greater flows on the grid, to reduce the risk of congestion and on potential risk curtailment, and to ensure the security, resilience, and reliability of the network. Just to bring to the table the experience of Terna, in order to cope with the challenges of integrating around 70 gigawatt of new renewable capacity within 2030, according to the new draft of the Italian National Energy and Climate Plan. Terna has presented in its 2023 development plan a new project called Hypergrid, consisting in the realization and construction of new connection, overhead and undersea connection, HVDC connection, that will double the transmission capacity from the southern areas of the country, characterized by higher renewable generation, and the northern area of the country characterized by high load. And potential delays in the permitting process or in the environmental impact analysis, or prolonged legal disputes might endanger and put the limits to the pace of implementation of this intervention, thus risking to limit also the development of the renewable energy in general and in the specific offshore. Therefore, putting in place additional fast-tracking measure in the permitting grantee process might have a relevant role in scaling up the development of renewable generation, and in particular offshore, and meet the ambitious climate and energy target of the European Union within 2030. Thank you.
Very clear. Thank you, Alessandro. I would like to follow up now. One of the very last elements that Kristin was starting to comment on is the issue of non-price criteria. And so from a potential project developer perspective, how do you approach this issue?
Yes, thank you. Now, this is a very difficult and complex area, I think, and it could create a lot of uncertainty, which could be kind of a barrier. So from a developer, or from us at least, we have discussed this a lot, and I think we would prefer. We agree that we need strict rules on nature, on coexistence, and on different topics, but we would prefer that these strict rules would be implemented in kind of the general regulation in the member states, and also be part of the approval concession process. But of course, you need to know upfront what kind of measures that are expected. So when you bid in, you need to know what kind of regulations you should apply to. But I think it's difficult to create criteria that we can compete on. We find that difficult, but in Norway, we have included kind of non-price criteria in the pre-qualification. So you need to at least be above some thresholds on different criteria. But the competition is a pure monetary competition for those who are pre-qualified. I think that's a model we prefer. We think it's more fair, and it's easier to kind of participate in such a competition. But I see that we need to put strict rules on all these criteria, either in the general rules or in pre-qualification type of things. Yeah, and it can vary from member state to member state, so there needs to be at least a kind of flexibility for the member state to decide, based on.
Indeed, as you point out, there is quite a big difference when this non-price criteria are integrated as part of a two-step tendering process with pre-qualification, where there could be some room maybe to adjustments and even negotiation or sharing information between consortium and just one step tendering. So that's also part of their experience and best practice sharing. But as well, competition threshold. Klaus, I would like to ask you about something you mentioned is about coexistence, and from your experience in Sweden, could you already identify some good practices to solve that early? And talking broad in terms of different interests at stake.
In general, we have, I think, in the past had huge problems with different interests and different processes that are more or less not working very well together, since they're usually building upon each other. So there's a sequential, but not specifically to the offshore wind sector, but when it comes to one of our great green steel projects, at least in the north of Sweden, has been the approach to do things more in parallel on several processes at the same time, so to say, to have them overlapping. Even though you're not really done with one process, you start the next one, you start the application for the environmental permit, while you also do the application to the government, to the local community to build somewhere, and so in that way to accelerate processes. Yeah, you understand what I mean. So that you try to do as much in parallel. That is, in some way, of course, it's risky. If you get a no somewhere, then everything falls down. But usually, as we've seen, people very often quite interesting also in these great projects to drive them ahead, so that everybody tries to cooperate, especially what you've seen in the north of Sweden, where these projects were really seen as very important to the further industrial development of Sweden. So we could parallelize processes, reducing the risk. And I think that is things that can be done also in the offshore industry or offshore permitting processes, all that stuff, more or less at the same time. But a lot of things have to be done first. So we need to still don't have a binding commitment by municipalities to allow something to be built, and that is something that has been proven to be a hinder, because every time before something starts to build, they can still say no, we don't want it. In the beginning, they can say yes, and then later can say, oh no, we reconsider it, or a new political steering in the municipality says, no, we don't like it anymore. There are things that have been a hinder that have been identified, and that can always be a problem in that type of doing things in parallel, that we apply to the municipality, go to the environmental impact assessment and so on. But many things can be done in parallel. But it always involves a risk. Although if you already order machinery or whatever before you really have all your permits clear, but there are things that might be nevertheless be attempted and risk. It's always a question that if you've done things a couple of times and you have experience also that can be shared across the country, that might help other municipalities and other companies to refer to those experiences, and it might be easier. Yeah? If you once have started and it has worked well, you can share experiences from those cases. And we have some work going on in the north of Sweden, where you also have some kind of coordinator that tries to speed up the green transformation in the north of Sweden, for example. So we're exploring a lot of things there, but we're not really there in the end to be as a perfect solution. But I think it's,
and you mentioned as well the delays created by the court proceedings, and that applies to many countries. And what we comment in the report was also the proposals to speed up the permitting, but court proceedings are not part of the timing for that, but the proposal is to having them as a priority when they come to the court, that the cases related to renewable energy is of overriding interest, also in terms of dealing with arbitration, court cases, and disputes. So that's
also discussion in Sweden to have specialized courts where you collect competencies within certain areas in one court, for example, because nowadays you can not have all the higher court has all the competencies, all so knowledge that is necessary. So you can make it easier to bundle necessary competence also in judicial in one place, for example, or fewer places. But that's only.
Thank you, Klaus. We are getting close to the end of this event, so I will just like to give the opportunity to MEP Morten Petersen again to make a final comment, and I will praise as well your personal involvement and in all these different reports and files that you have been working on, and including the very good report on offshore wind that you have been drafted. So any final comment or views before we close the webinar? Thank you.
No, well, congratulations on the study. I think it's extremely important to have studies out there on these topics, because coming back to the overall theme of adopting a common approach, I mean, we need to think hard on how to do this, because again, we're way too much stuck in a very, say, national approach to these issues, and if we are to fulfill our ambitions on climate and on deployment on renewables, we need to think cross-border, and in order to identify all the obstacles that are inherent in this, I think this report is extremely valuable, and the work you're doing is extremely useful. So thanks so much for the opportunity to be with you today, and I hope we'll stay in touch on this important issue. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Morten. And I give the word to Mala. Please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Catherine. And a big thanks to all of our panelists and presenters for this great discussion, and also for everyone joining us online today. So if you have any further questions or comments on today's event or report, please do get in touch. We will also share the link to our report and the recording of the session with all participants afterwards. And yes, I just wish everyone a great rest of the day, and looking forward to speaking again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.